Welcome home, my little hellhounds. Tonight we have 3 scary stories to sink our hellish teeth into. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Also, if you like this content, then don't forget to subscribe, and if you would be so kind and click that like button, as that really helps the channel. Don't forget to tickle the bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. Now, let's get right into it. I think I saw a skinwalker in Australia, posted by Flem87. My husband and I were driving to my brother's for Christmas a few years back. We lived in regional Victoria, Australia, and he lived in Brisbane, Queensland, Australia. It was about 2 or 3 a.m. and pitch black. Once we were reasonably close, 4 to 5 hours away, we had to go up and over this mountain rainforesty area in the middle of nowhere to get there. It was raining, misty and freezing cold, which was weird because it was the middle of summer, and anyone who lives in Australia knows how hot it gets in the summer here. But I figured rainforests are usually wet and cold. Anyway, we were rounding this really narrow corner, and out of nowhere, up beside me, was this thing. It looked like it was trying to cross the road, and it stopped and ran back into the woods. When we almost hit it, my husband thinks it was a giant koala. He doesn't believe in paranormal or anything weird, but he didn't get a good look at it like I did. It was right next to me on the passenger side door. To me, it looked like a skinny, lanky person on all fours, covered in fur. It had the face of a person and the body of a person, but was walking on its knuckles and legs. Its eyes glowed like a cat's eyes in the dark as our headlights hit it. It freaked me out, and to this day, I still don't know what the hell it was that I saw, but it's burned into my memory. Was it a giant mutant koala? A skinwalker? Yowie? Sasquatch? What do you guys think? Autopilot, posted by Mighty Kwai Fish. Have you ever forgotten your phone? When did you realise you'd forgotten it? I'm guessing you didn't just smack your forehead and exclaim, "Damn," apropos of nothing. The realisation probably didn't dawn on you spontaneously. More likely you reached for your phone, pouring open your pocket or handbag, and were momentarily confused by it not being there. Then you did a mental restep of the morning's events. Shit. In my case, my phone's alarm woke me up as normal, but I realised the battery was lower than I expected. It was a new phone, and it had this annoying habit of leaving applications running that drain the battery overnight. So I put it on charge while I showered, instead of into my bag like normal. It was a momentarily slip from the routine, but that was all it took. Once in my shower, my brain got back into the routine. It follows every morning, and that was it. Forgotten. This wasn't just me being clumsy. As I later researched, this is a recognized brain function. Your brain doesn't just work on one level, it works on many. Like when you're walking somewhere, you think about your destination and avoiding hazards, but you don't need to think about keeping your legs moving properly. If you did, the entire world would turn into one massive, hilarious cosplay. I wasn't thinking about regulating my breathing. I was thinking whether I should grab a coffee on the drive to work. I did. I wasn't thinking about moving my breakfast through my intestines. I was wondering whether I'd finish on time to pick up my daughter Emily from nursery after work, or get stuck with another late fee. This is the thing. There's a level of your brain that just deals with routine, so that the rest of the brain can think about other things. Think about it. Think about your last commute. What do you actually remember? Little, if anything. Probably most common journeys blur into one, and recalling any one in particular is scientifically proven to be difficult. Do something often enough and it becomes routine. Keep doing it and it stops being processed by the thinking bit of the brain and gets regulated to a part of the brain dedicated to dealing with routine. Your brain keeps doing it without you thinking about it. Soon, you think about your route to work as much as you do keeping your legs moving when you walk, as in, not at all. Most people call it autopilot, but there's a danger there. If you have a break in your routine, your ability to remember and account for the break is only as good as your ability to stop your brain going into routine mode. My ability to remember my phone being on the counter is only as reliable as my ability to stop my brain entering morning routine mode, which would dictate that my phone is actually in my bag. But I didn't stop my brain entering routine mode. I got in the shower as normal. Routine started. Exception forgotten. Autopilot engaged. My brain was back in the routine. I showered, I shaved. The radio forecast amazing weather. I gave Emily her breakfast and loaded her into the car. She was so adorable that morning. She complained about the bad sun in the morning blinding her, saying it stopped her having a little sleep on the way to nursery, and left. That was the routine. It didn't matter that my phone was on the counter charging silently. My brain was in the routine, and in the routine my phone was in my bag. This is why I forgot my phone. Not clumsiness, not negligence, nothing more. My brain entering routine mode and overwriting the exception. Autopilot engaged. I left for work. It's a swelteringly hot day already. The bad sun had been burning since before my traitorously absent phone woke me up. The steering wheel was burning hot to the touch. When I sat down, I think I heard Emily shift over behind my driver's seat to get out of the glare, but I got to work, submitted the report, attended the morning meeting. It's not until I took a quick coffee break and reached for my phone that the illusion shattered. I did a mental reset. I remembered the dying battery. I remembered putting it on to charge. I remembered leaving it there. My phone was on the counter. Autopilot. Disengaged. Again, therein lies the danger until you have that moment. The moment you reach for your phone and shatter the illusion. That part of the brain is still in routine mode. It has no reason to question the facts of the routine. That's why it's a routine. Attrition of repetition. It's not as if anyone could say, "Why didn't you remember your phone? Didn't it occur to you? How could you forget?" You must be negligent. This is to miss the point. My brain was telling me the routine was completed as normal, despite the fact that it wasn't. It wasn't that I forgot my phone. According to my brain, according to the routine, my phone was in my bag. Why would I think to question it? Why would I check? Why would I suddenly remember out of nowhere that my phone was on the counter? My brain was wired into the routine, and the routine was that the phone was in my bag. The day continued to bake. The morning haze gave way to the relentless fever heat of the afternoon. Tarmac bubbled. The direct beams of heat threatened to crack the pavement. People swapped coffees for iced smoothies. Jackets discarded, sleeves rolled up, ties loosened, brows mopped. The park slowly filled with sunbathers and barbecues. Window frames threatened to warp. The thermometer continued to swell. Thank fuck the offices were air-conditioned. But as ever, the furnace of the day gave way to a cooler evening. Another day, another dollar. Still cursing myself for forgetting my phone, I drove home. The day's heat had baked the inside of the car, releasing a horrible smell from somewhere. When I arrived on the driveway, the stones crunching comfortably under my tyres, my wife greeted me at the door. "Where's Emily?" Fuck. As if the phone wasn't bad enough after everything, I'd left Emily at the fucking nursery after all. I immediately sped back to the nursery. I got to the door and started practicing my excuses, wondering vainly if I could charm my way out of a late fee. I saw a piece of paper stuck to the door. Due to vandalism overnight, please use side door today only. Overnight? What? The door was fine this morning. I froze. My knees shook. Vandals. A change in the routine. My phone was on the counter. I hadn't been here this morning. My phone was on the counter. I'd driven past because I was drinking my coffee. I'd not dropped off Emily. My phone was on the counter. She'd moved her seat. I hadn't seen her in the mirror. My phone was on the counter. She'd fallen asleep out of the bad sun. She didn't speak when I drove past her nursery. My phone was on the counter. She'd changed the routine. My phone was on the counter. She'd changed the routine and I'd forgotten to drop her off. My phone was on the counter. 9 hours, that car, that baking sun, no air, no water, no power, no help. That heat, a steering wheel too hot to touch. That smell. I walked to the car door, numb, shock. I opened the door. My phone was on the counter, and my daughter was dead. Autopilot, disengaged. Dream Girl, posted by Erucius. She's walking through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I rubbed the bridge of my nose and took another sip of coffee. It was strong, black and warm from sitting untouched for so long. I looked back at what I had written, 12 verses, written over 3 years, and each more troubling than the last. This poem would likely be my unfinished work, a labour of love that would remain my final mystery. But the poem's subject is herself, a mystery to me. Lisa, the darling girl of my dreams, who steals a little more of my soul every night, has been with me for 5 long years. Lisa, the girl who no longer exists. I stroll through the halls of academia. I move through a silence that creeps. She glides like a goddess of reason, this angel who comes when I sleep. I wrote those words on January 25th, 2014. I was a sophomore in high school, still struggling to mould my burgeoning talent while dealing with the growing flames of my teenage horniness. For years, I'd been told that I wrote well, English teachers and creative writing teachers praising my work, but they always said that it lacked a focus that they hoped I would find in time. Your ideas are scattered, your thoughts uncoordinated, and for someone with your raw talent, these are threads that we hope you will find. This is what my 9th grade English teacher wrote on my final assignment. A short story about the idea of servitude, but not slavery. Right under the lurid red A she'd written on the paper, Ms. Harper had often told me that I had talent and told me that she expected me to focus that talent if I ever thought to make something of myself in the writing trade. On that day, as I sat at the picnic tables outside the cafeteria and wrote ideas in my notebook, I found some of the threads she was talking about. I had slept deeply the night before and dreamed vividly, as I did sometimes. In the dream, I was walking through the halls of Chester C. Smith High School, and on that day, I walked alone. There was none of the usual tropey at school in your underpants sort of thing. But the school did have a slightly lucid feel to it. I felt like I was underwater, everything having a slightly wavy feeling to it. As I walked, I began to become more and more sure that something was watching me. There was no one there. The silence in the school was almost oppressive. But at the edge of my vision, I could just make out the form of a girl following me. She slid silently along the walls, glided noiselessly through the world. Several times as I whipped around, suddenly I could just see her hiding from me. Those few glimpses were enough to tell me two things. She was human and she was lovely. She stalks through my dreams like a shadow, a hunting cat ready to pounce. Her mind is a mystery to me. Her very secrecy, humanity renounced. I had the dream again a week later. It was much the same, walking through the silent halls of high school, the terrain wavering like aquarium weeds as this ghostly girl stalked me. I did not indicate that I was aware of her, not turning or speaking, but just studying her from out of my eye. She was blonde, corn silk hair spilling down her back in a sheet, and her clothes were a pair of jeans and a simple shirt of no particular design. She seemed to be my age, but could have been older. There was a way about her that made me think she was older than I in her mind. Like when you meet someone who's had to grow up very quickly and been forced to cast their childhood aside before they were comfortable. She followed me silently until I woke up, and when I sat up, I grabbed for my notepad on the nightstand and wrote those 4 lines. I wouldn't revisit her for 3 months. Her secrecy seems to be prudent, for her shelters not solely her own. I have seen that which lurks in the shadows, and it threatens to evict her from home. Writing about the Dream Girl. Dream Girl was what I had named it after the second verse had lit a fire in me. It seemed suddenly I wrote pieces of every school contest, submitted poems for every poetry club event, and gained a small amount of celebrity amongst the students that followed in those circles. My teachers had always praised my work, but as my peers noticed my talent, I started to see this as more than a hobby. I began to believe that I might be able to make it outside of my high school community. When the spring poetry contest was announced, a contest held for students nationwide, I threw myself into it, heart and soul. I stayed up for 3 days, crafting the perfect poem, the most significant work of my life. When I hit send on the submission email, I slumped back into my chair and let the euphoria wash over me. It was Saturday night. I was exhausted after the effort of birthing my perfect work into the world, and all I wanted to do was sleep. I crawled into bed and fell into a deep and untroubled sleep for the next 12 hours. I learned more about her world in those 12 hours than I wanted to. I walked through the doors of my high school and saw the ethereal backdrop of my dream again. It was comfortable here. The quiet serenity of the place was changed from the steady flow of ideas and couplets running through my head lately, but something was missing. I looked behind me expecting to see her dodge away or hide from me, but she wasn't there. This was the only time I could remember being truly alone in this place, and it was a little strange. To feel so alien in a place that you occupy every day is a strange feeling indeed, but I felt my steps taking me into the school once more, so I let myself be led wherever the dream was taking me. As I walked, I was aware of a noise. The fact that there was a noise at all was strange, but the type of noise was stranger still. It was a vibration, a rhythmic thumping from under my feet, and it disturbed this place's unusual stillness. Thump, 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 then silence. A few minutes or hours or days later, there would be another thump, 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 followed by a return to the same silence. As I explored the high school, I found myself drawn to the boiler room over by my civics class. The more I thought about it, the more I realised that the thumping was probably coming from there. The boiler room was a large subterranean basement used by the custodians to store excess chemicals and broken machinery they were hoping to fix someday. It was also where students of less scholarity caste went to make out or smoke between classes, since it lacked a fire alarm. When I got close to the boiler room, I heard the thumping more clearly and realised I'd been right. There was definitely something in the boiler room, something big, and I doubted it was a group of teenagers necking a little too enthusiastically. When I wrapped my hands around the door handles, though, I was immediately thrown backwards into the lockers against the far wall as something came barreling up through the stairs. It was her, the dream girl, and she turned to glare at me, teeth bared in a feral challenge. When she saw who I was, she stopped growling and scrambled down the hall towards the English classroom. I sat against the lockers, my backside aching where it had connected with the lockers, and listening to something big and angry make its way up the stairs. I didn't want to know what was making that noise, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there against the lockers. I'm not one to freeze up in dreams. A familiarity with lucid dreaming had probably led me to become way too comfortable in these dreams. But as whatever it was lumbered angrily up from the depths, I realised a fear I hadn't known since childhood. The slap on my shoulder brought me out of these fears as the blonde girl thrust her hand at me and spoke the first words of our strange relationship. "If you don't want to die, then you better start running." She offered me a hand, and a moment later we were flying down the polished halls. As we rounded the corner, I heard something burst through the doors. It sounded like an angry piece of construction equipment as it followed us, chewing up anything that got in its way. My guide took us down hallway after hallway, taking corners at random, before finally wrenching open the door to the custodial closet and pushing both of us inside. She closed the door behind us, cracking it a little as she peeks out into the hallway. All I could do was lean against the wall and pant. I was tired. I didn't ever recall being tired in a dream before, and as I sat, I realised my butt still hurt where I'd hit it on the locker. I wanted to ask things, what was chasing us and why it was chasing us, but as the thumping footsteps got closer to our hidden cubby, I was filled once more with that sense of dread. I moved up beside her, peeking out into the hallway as a creature like nothing I'd ever seen before dragged itself into view. It was a shadow. It was darkness. And as its form slither crawled past us, it looked to be amorphous and boundless. She closed the door quietly before it came even with it and sat back in the closet as the creature moved off into a different part of the school. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before I dared to speak. What the hell was that? She looked at me quizzically, and I feared she was incapable of hearing me. I would later come to realise how long it had been since she'd had anyone to talk to. She closed her eyes as I repeated my question and seemed to savour the sound they made. She relished them, burned them into her memory, rolled around in them like a dog with a smell it likes, and when she'd finally absorbed them as much as possible, she answered me, "I don't know, I've been calling it shade for however long it is that I've been here." Her voice was thick from disuse, but it was cultured, with just a hint of an accent that I couldn't place. She told me her name was Lisa. She told me she believed she was 16, but couldn't be sure. She told me she had been here as long as she could remember. She told me that she could move between dreams. Between dreams? What do you mean? Instead of telling, she showed me. Her hand looked like a starfish when she set it against the back wall of the janitor's closet. The pinkness of her skin stood out against the dingy wall and made it all the more apparent when the paint began to crumble and the wall started to melt away. Suddenly there was sunlight in the closet, thick and buttery against the dingy darkness. We were looking at a field of flowers that stretched on into infinity. I put my hand against the image, expecting resistance, but instead fell into a landscape of fragrant technicolor flowers. Lisa came in behind me, and as she did, the portal back to the high school was closed. "Where are we?" She shrugged. "Some other dream. She has it pretty often. As long as we stay out of the area where she is, then she'll never know we were here." I had a million questions to ask her, too many to organise right away, but just as I'd found my voice again, someone was shaking me, and my mom was asking if I was hungry and might like some dinner. It was 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hoping and praying before the dream returned. I sit at the edge of the precipice, looking at the world from afar. I am a prisoner of my reality. My passage to her world has been barred. I spent those 2 weeks in a haze. I received word that my poem had gone to the Nationals, and I think that my distracted nature was seen as a dazed relief. They thought I was happy that I was living in the clouds in my mind. However, I just wanted to go back to the dream. She needed me, and I needed to know more about her. I spent those 2 weeks analysing what I now knew about the dream. The first was that whatever happened in the dream happened in real life. I had woken up the next morning with a large bruise on my backside and a similar bruise on my shoulder. Either I had hurt myself outside the dream and it had translated into the dream itself, something I doubted, or I could be hurt inside the dream. The second thing was far more urgent. I needed to find out how to instigate the dream. I tried recreating the events that led to the dream, dragging myself to the edge of collapse or overworking my mind without rest until I dropped, but it was no use. 2 weeks later and I hadn't had so much as a dream that I could remember in the little amount of sleep that I'd gotten. As I went to sleep that night, I focused all my mental faculties on the dream itself, how it had felt, the landscape I'd been in, and as I focused I could feel my mind slipping off to sleep. I awoke in high school again. I ran through the halls, heedless of what else might find me, and it wasn't long before she had tracked me down again. She dropped into the hallway before me, seemingly from nowhere, and when she saw me, her face split into a wide grin. She ran to me, wrapping me in her arms. She smelled ethereal as I wrapped my arms around her as well, like old dust of sour memories of the universe itself. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, and in her voice I heard relief. Her world lies alongside my own. My dreams, the key to her realm. But how did she come to reside here? Her own dreams have been overwhelmed. She took me back to the field of flowers. There she answered my questions. I asked her a million questions as we sat together in the field. We had found a tree that sprang from the flowers, and we sat there as she told me her story. Until that moment I believed she was older than I, maybe by as much as 5 years, but as she spoke her girlhood came back to her. She drew her knees in close, her blonde hair creating a curtain through which she peeked at me, and she seemed embarrassed by the story. No, not embarrassed, I now realised. She was afraid that telling it to me would make it real. She had her own dream once. She couldn't remember what had happened before it, but she could remember being there before. She had dreamed inside a castle and played princess with knights and wizards at her command, and dragons and goblins to slay. Sometimes she had stood on the battlements and looked pretty as the knights fought for her favour. Sometimes she had put on armour and killed the dragons herself, leading her knights on grand adventures. Whatever she was doing, she was happy, and the dream had returned almost every night. It returned because I wanted it to. It came back because I thought about it before bed, and so my mind opened the portal to this place. These dreams aren't normal dreams. You can get hurt in them, and you can even die in them. When you dream here, your mind takes you to a place in the spirit world. I don't know how, so don't ask, but I know that it is so. She had dreamed this dream for quite some time, years, she said, when one day something different happened. Her knights had encountered something on the edges of her kingdom that had killed some of them. None of my knights had ever died in my dream. They would get hurt sometimes, but a wizard would always heal them. When they didn't come back and the wizard couldn't make them come back, I knew this was different. I knew this was something else. For 2 nights it had destroyed her dream world. When it came to the castle, I was too afraid to fight it. It was dark and scary, and it looked wrong. I hid inside the castle, unable to face it, and as it broke down my walls, I closed my eyes and tried to wake up. I tried and tried, but it wouldn't happen. And when it finally got me, I woke up somewhere else. That was when she discovered that she could make portals between dreams. She had thrown her slayed hand against the castle wall as the bulbous thing had loomed over her, and suddenly a circle had appeared in the wall. It showed a desert in the throes of a sandstorm, and she'd even jumped in without a second thought. She'd woken up in someone else's dream. She floats like a dandelion dreamer, adrift on the seas of a dream, never to return to her own mind. Her world never to be as it seems. I visited with her often over the next few years. The dreams came almost every night, and as we explored, we grew closer. She told me that no matter how much she tried, she couldn't wake up. She could sleep, still needed to sleep, but as for eating and drinking, she found that she didn't need those things anymore. The bulbous creature followed her no matter where she went, but she was able to avoid it, and over time, she just became used to living inside other people's dreams. She didn't know how long she'd done it, and she didn't care. I was not the first person to talk to her, but I was the only one who believed she was more than a figment of their imagination. This dream girl has stolen my senses. Her beauty has taken my mind. I know that life is ephemeral, but I know that her heart must be mine. I didn't acknowledge right away that I was falling for her, but I think I knew deep down. My poems became all about her, this ephemeral goddess that walked my dreams, and my fans responded. I had members of the art club asking to paint her from my description. I had droves of female fans asking me to tell who she was. They believed she was someone at the school that I was sharing my nights with. I had people who had read my work asking about her, my moonlight girlfriend, but I gave out very little information. For her part, I could tell that she appreciated my company, but she seemed afraid to get close to me. As months became years, she showed me sights that defied description. She took me to dreamscapes so beautiful that I could hardly grasp them, and to places so wondrous I could scarcely describe them, but she refused to tell me what she was looking for. Her hand would creep into mine on occasion, though, and I remember being filled with warmth each time she touched me. Inevitably, our night excursions would be cut short by the appearance of the shadow creature. He would blunder upon us, his screamy sucking sound glopping before him, and we would flee until he moved away. She never fought him and said it would be useless to try, but I somehow knew that she would never really be safe as long as it existed. As time passed, I noticed her become more melancholy, and one night I asked what was troubling her. She took my hand, interlocking our fingers, and looked at me across what seemed like thousands of miles. I don't want this to be my life anymore. I want to hold your hand, feel its texture, and know that I won't be left alone when the dawn comes. I want to leave this place. I'm sick of looking over my shoulder for the shadow creature. I want a life. She sounded so sad, so adrift, but I had no idea how to help her. She longs to leave her forever, this kingdom ethereum so deep. She wishes to walk in the moonlight, to walk her own dreams as she sleeps. I was in my senior year when she left me forever. I came into the dream high school that I'd come to know as well, and found her sitting in an empty classroom. She was seated in one of the desks, and at first I thought she was asleep when she turned to me and looked at me, though I could see that she was deep in contemplation. She looked up at me with real hope, and I realised that something had happened while I was gone. I think I need to destroy the shade. She detailed her plan. How if she killed it, she might be allowed to go back to her dream and wake up. But all I could hear was the first lines of her suicide note. I tried to reason with her, talk her out of this needless waste of her life, but she wouldn't hear it. I had clearly underestimated her resolve, and every argument against it only seemed to infuriate her more. I thought you were different. I thought you would understand how important this was to me. Well, to hell with you then. I'm going with or without you. She walked out and I let her go, unable to say any more. When I woke up, I fought sleep for the next 4 days. By then I was almost out of high school, about to start college, and my poems had appeared in magazines and compilations since my senior year. I woke up in my familiar bedroom and immediately went to find a cup of coffee. For the next 4 days I drank coffee, took caffeine pills. My face stung from slapping it and fought the urge to sleep. I didn't want to go back to that place and see what had happened to her. The thought that she was dead scared me. The thought of what she had become if she killed Shade scared me even more. Eventually I lost the battle and I was forced to submit to sleep. When I returned to the halls, it was like the first time. I felt no one, and the silence was oppressive. In ethereal halls, I wonder, the only sounds are my own. I listen for her, but hear nothing. I find myself all alone. I searched for her for hours. I combed the school, every classroom and mop closet, from the library to the gym, but she was nowhere to be found. I quickly found myself running through the halls, calling her name as I threw caution to the wind and wanted nothing but the solace of her voice and her presence. I wanted to see her, to know she was okay, and to apologize for my cowardice. Cowardice I was still indulging even then. I would not let myself think about the cellar, but I'm past that now. I'm going to find her. Tonight, I'm going into the basement and settle this once and for all. My parents will likely find this, as well as my last poem, and if they do, I hope they send it to my editor so she can publish what will likely be my last work. I'm going in there. I'm going to bring Lisa out, or I'm going to die trying. I will have my dream girl. And that's it for tonight, my little hellhounds. Thank you for listening. Remember, if you have any scary stories, then submit them to Reddit r/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click that bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.